Well, good morning, all. I'm Dr. Laura Lacher, and welcome to today's Medical Grand Rounds. Just a couple announcements before we do introductions for today. Next week, February 10th, there will be a break from Grand Rounds for an alternative activity, so please use that time as you see fit. And then be sure to join us back the following week on Tuesday, February 17th. That will be the annual Boyden Lectureship. It will be the talk, Ultimately, It's About Identity, Narrative Medicine and Personhood, given by Dr. Alessa Coliani. And just a quick reminder that Grand Rounds is a collaboration between Providence Portland and Providence St. Vincent Medical Centers. We typically meet here live on Tuesday mornings at 8 a.m. in Southern Auditorium at St. Vincent, and sometimes at noon, also on Tuesdays at Providence Portland. You can always join us virtually on Teams Live. You can earn CME credit for being in the room, watching live virtual, or watching a recording of the event. If you look at the weekly Grand Rounds invite, it will let you know when and where we will be, and you can also find the link to the recording. I'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout today's session for those of you joining on Teams Live, and mostly hold those questions until the end as time permits. And now I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker. We are joined by Dr. Qian Lang. She is a practicing internist and clinician educator at Providence Portland Medical Center. Dr. Lang was born in mainland China and grew up in Arizona before going on to complete degrees in both medicine and public health at Harvard. She then came to Portland to do her internal medicine residency at OHSU and worked 6 years as a hospitalist in the legacy system before leaving to pursue a fellowship in health services research at the Portland VA. Dr. Lang has many interests, including mindfulness and movement. She is a yoga and Pilates instructor, as well as a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging expert. Dr. Lang is currently working on a QI project to increase language concordant primary care in the Portland area through a health equity fellowship and grant. Dr. Lang, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on this side of the river. I'm usually on the east side. So everyone's should have a piece of paper with a scenario on it, right? So we're gonna have people sit next to people who are in their same group. So I know this is gonna be a little bit tricky, but I was wondering if we could arrange ourselves so that if you have case one, you're at the top left, and then two here, just because we're going to be doing a group activity, and so it will only make sense if you are with your group. So sorry. Yeah, exactly. We want to prevent DVTs, right? That's a main goal. So the back, yeah.
Line 811, right?
Great. Okay. Hey, so as you guys are getting arranged, I'll go ahead and get started. So my goals for this talk are to teach the history that we didn't learn, share the results from a study that I did with a group of wonderful medical students, practice interventions on microaggressions and discrimination, which is why you're in the clustered groups, and then to empower action for social justice. So here's me in 5th grade. I decided that I wanted to learn about Asian Americans at this time because I had never heard anything in school history or social studies about Asian Americans. So I crack open this big book that's hundreds of pages long in my social studies class, go to the index because back then there was indexes instead of just searches, and I look up Asian Americans. And I find that there's one page referencing this topic. So flipping to that page, there's about 2 paragraphs there. And all it said was that some Chinese Americans were brought over to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. They were given the most dangerous jobs. A lot of them got blown up, and the ones that survived ended up in San Francisco and eventually opened laundromats. So that was the extent of all coverage of Asian Americans in my textbook. So I just want to check in with the group here. Who has ever learned about a single Asian American person in history of social studies in K through 12? Great, who did you learn about? Okay, wonderful. Okay, that's so amazing that existed. Yes, in Asian literature. Okay. And then most people have not heard of anyone who's an Asian American that they learn about. So that's why I want to start this talk by sharing a brief history of US policies toward Asian Americans to give us a context for understanding why we did this study. So way back in 1875 was the first sort of policy I could find, and that was the Page Act to block entry of Asian women into the United States. So it's actually stated in this judge's statement that Oriental women were lewd and that they were at risk of bringing diseases into the country. So Asian women could only be able to enter the country after being subject to physical interrogation that in today's terms will be considered sexual assault. This didn't outright ban Asian women from emigrating, but it was highly effective at deterring people from wanting to come, resulting in 95% of early Asian immigrants being men. And then for those men, things were pretty rough too, because there were no Asian women here, and interracial marriage was illegal until 1967 in the famous case Loving versus Virginia. Next, moving on to 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. This one actually did ban Chinese men as well from emigrating to the US because of fears of Asians stealing American jobs. A very persistent fear. But at that time, as you can see, Chinese Americans were 0.002% of the population. Feng Yueting was a man who was actually hired by an American company to work in the US. And then at one point, the details are a little bit murky, he was detained along with two other Chinese men. And then he actually sued to be allowed to stay in the United States, but lost and was ultimately deported. And I know this seems like ancient history from 1882, but I can't help but feel the eerie echoes of similar events happening today when I think about ICE workers, ICE officers stationed outside daycares in Minneapolis trying to find people to deport, people who are working for American-owned businesses and taking care of our children. Denial of citizenship was another tool used to exclude Asian Americans. So in 1790, the Naturalization Act set the bar fairly low to become a US citizen. All you had to do was be white and have lived in the US for 2 years, and you were considered a citizen. Then there were two notable cases with Takoa Ozawa in 1914 and Bhagat Singh Thind in 1923, who were two Asian people who sued for their citizenship. And one of them was actually born in the US. And unfortunately, in both these cases, they ruled that they could not be eligible to become citizens because they were not white. Then in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act finally eliminated race, national origin, and ancestry as a basis for banning immigration. However, quotas continue to exist for Asian immigration, creating these special immigrant categories that included physicians, scientists, and engineers that allowed for these people with these professions to come to this country. I think right now there's this stereotype that Asian Americans don't face discrimination in these fields because they're so highly represented. But actually, it is because of this discriminatory policy in US history that selected for these people to come here. And you can see here, this is Lyndon B. Johnson signing the act, and right behind him is Martin Luther King Jr., who was a major proponent and really instrumental in getting this act to be passed. Another way of exclusion was prohibiting land ownership. So the alien land laws of 1910 and 1920s in California targeted Japanese and Chinese Americans and prohibited them from owning property due to them being non-citizens. So you might be thinking, wow, these things are really, far back in the past. Is this still relevant for today? So this is 2023. The Senate Bill 147 in Texas was a bill to ban Chinese citizens as well as Iranian, North Korean, and Russian citizens from purchasing any land or home or real estate in Texas. I remember finding out about this bill and being highly alarmed, and my spouse and I actually joined a phone banking effort to notify Asian Americans in Texas and activate people to come and protest this. When this bill went to the Senate for voting, there were so many protesters that people filled the entire space and were in the streets, and the bill did get shut down. And we were like, yes, advocacy does something. But then when I was preparing for this talk, I decided to do a little update and see what's happened. So it appears that we now have the Alien Land Law of 2025. So quietly, without the notice of anyone nationally, they reintroduced almost an identical bill that was passed in June and is now part of the law of Texas starting in September. So it specifically, again, targets Chinese, Iranian, North Korean, and Russian descent people in Texas. And it's identical to the first bill with one carve out that citizens and green card holders can own one primary residence. I find this to be really interesting because the justification for the bill, they were like, it's not racist, it's not racist. We're trying to limit foreign influence in Texas. But if you were a white European person, let's say you were German, you could own unlimited land in Texas, as much as you could afford, which is so interesting to me because the US has actually gone to war with Germany, has not gone to war with China. But if a resident there wanted to buy a second house for a rental property, wouldn't be able to. So this is kind of the historical context, and then we're going to switch gears and talk about why we did this study. So in 2022, we're in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and I've been a hospitalist for 6 years at that point. And due to a couple of very difficult interactions with patients, I felt like I needed to take a step back from clinical care full time. And then also, having done an MPH, I always wanted to get into research, but didn't have time, who does? So then I pursued a health services research fellowship at the VA. And I was also the chapter advisor for PAMSA, the Asian Pacific Islander Medical Student Association. So as we were talking there, we were talking about how, wow, things are difficult. People are being called racial slurs, people are being spat on, our elders are getting pushed down and assaulted in public transport. Like, things are pretty hard. And we weren't the only one feeling this way. So according to this JAMA study tracking turnover among healthcare workers, you can see the gray line is Asian Americans, and there's a huge uptick in that early COVID era. So I was also very influenced by the work of law professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, when she states that people with different intersectional identities have more discrimination and biases that they face. It got me thinking about, wow, what is it about the intersectional identities of being both Asian American and being a woman? What are the challenges that these people face working in healthcare? So that was the inspiration for our study. And I just want to do a little caveat here, kind of pulling from the work of Robin DiAngelo. When she writes her intro to White Fragility, she admits that she's centering the conversation on white Americans and white, primarily audience. But she also says that this is her perspective and her lens, and this is where she can contribute to the field of anti-racism. And so in our study, we are not saying that other groups of people like Black Americans, Arabs, Indigenous peoples, LGBT peoples, Latin Americans are not facing these same challenges. They absolutely are, but we felt like we were finally able to kind of shed light on a group of people that have been really underrepresented in research as research subjects that we could actually accurately represent. So before we get into the findings of the study, I just want to give a definition about microaggressions, since that was one of the main topics of our study. So Gerald Wing Su, a psychologist who was actually from Oregon, was one of the pioneers in using this term, and he says that microaggressions are the everyday slights which communicate derogatory or negative messages to target persons solely because of their marginalized group status. But the word microaggressions actually was used earlier by a Black psychiatrist, Dr. Chester Price. He was the first person to coin this term as he was working at Harvard at that time. And he makes this note that the micro of microaggressions does not refer to the impact. It's micro because they're small acts that are dealt just casually, anytime, every day. So they're both subtle and stunning. Subtle in the delivery of just an offhand comment, but stunning in the impact it has on the target, especially cumulatively over time. So for our study, we conducted a qualitative study with one-on-one in-depth interviews that lasted anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour and a half, with 25 self-identifying Asian American women in the Pacific Northwest who occupied a variety of roles. So RP stands for resident physician, AP stands for attending physician. And here's the breakdown of our sample. Slight majority of physicians, and then nursing assistants, MAs, and nurses and NPs. This is the ethnicity of our sample, largely Chinese and Taiwanese, but you can see there's also a smattering representation from Southeast Asia, Korea, and India. The generational status we thought was important because some people might assume that these microaggressions only happen to people who are newly immigrated, but the majority of our sample were actually second-generation Americans, people who were born in the US to immigrant patients, including some who were third and fourth generation even. So our findings show that the types of workplace bias that our participants experience fell into three larger categories: microaggressions, overt aggressions, and discrimination. So microaggressions are those kind of everyday, often unintentional slights, and this included undervaluing of our participants and lower perception of their competence. They were also stereotypes as being perpetually foreign. Overt aggressions included harassment, both verbal and sexual harassment, and physical threats, including one death threat. And discrimination we defined as sort of microaggressions being interpersonal and discrimination being more organizational level issues. And this occurred in the form of patients' refusal of care when it was common enough to really impact someone being able to do their job. The expectation that our participants would do more work without an increase in compensation or credits, as well as exclusion from promotion and leadership roles. So instead of having us kind of go through some of these quotes, I thought a more vivid way to use narrative medicine to practice empathy and perspective taking would be for us to actually do a writing exercise. So on your sheet of paper, each group has a scenario. So we're going to take the next 5 minutes to actually answer these questions for your scenario. So the first question is, which category does this fit into? A microaggression, an overt aggression, or discrimination? How is this demeaning or invalidating? How could you respond as the person who's targeted? And how could you respond as a bystander? So we'll just take a few minutes for people to jot this down. If you don't have a pen, you can think about it in your head, or you can write it out on your phone. Yes, does anybody need a pen? And then if anyone is joining us on Teams, would we be able to drop the handout into the chat? I don't know if that's possible. No? Okay. For answering question 3 and 4, I want you to write in the first person narrative as if this is the exact words that you were going to say. I will take about 1 more minute and then wrap up on the writing exercise. The second portion of this is partner practice. Um, the reason that I think this is really important is that when microaggressions happen, they tend to occur very quickly, right? It's just like a flash in the pan, boom, and then we're all busy, and it might be very easy to let the opportunity to slip to actually do some kind of intervention. And so if we actually practice saying these words, we will feel more confident in this fast-paced, stressful time to actually be able to intervene. So I want you to find someone in your same group, has the same scenario, find a partner, and explain your responses, and then practice saying your intervention as the person who's targeted and as the person who's the bystander, and then we'll switch roles. Nobody has to be the perpetrator, don't worry.
A couple of scenarios. Okay. Sure. I know you did. It's weird how it won't let us. So.
Just like,
Yeah.
really bad. What I think is, like,
Because I was just like, there has to be a way. So at least they online have.
You and I are like.
But I do think. On that. I'm sorry to disappoint. Yeah.
All right, we'll wrap up in the next minute or so for the partner exercise. So thank you to everyone for doing the partner practice. Let's bring it back to a larger group discussion. So we're going to go through each of the cases and see how each group responded to them. Oops. Okay. So this is case 1. And so I think that was this group here, right? Yeah. Do you want to take us through 1 and 2 and maybe an example or two for the bystander and then the target person's responses?
Implies that the person is, oh, thank you. It implies that the person is foreign and makes assumptions about competency based off of their appearance. And we talked about a answer for 3 would be being a little blunt and just saying, well, English is my primary language and I was born here. And maybe something fairly similar for number 4. And also kind of saying something along the lines of, and they're an excellent physician, you're in good hands.
Great, thank you. Yeah, any reactions from the larger group who didn't get this case? Is this
I was just saying that I admire the directness, and my medical student here had an equally direct response to number 4. And I think that helps instead of pussyfooting around, which I might be inclined to do.
I think you bring up a really important point is that depending on the personality, the power dynamics, like different responses are probably needed in different times. And not all of us are going to feel comfortable doing a direct confrontation. And then sometimes another more subtle tactic like redirecting or humor or something like that might feel more doable to someone. Yeah, and any other thoughts on the first scenario? Okay, let's move on to the second one then. I think that would be this group.
So we had a very similar discussion for this one being like direct and just saying that, that's inappropriate. That's not something you can say to me. I'm here to help. And we also talked about like having the patient almost kind of like reflect, be like, oh, I didn't hear that. Do you want to try that again? Kind of thing. And And that may be even for someone who's like a bystander or something to say.
And then you brought up something that I thought was interesting, if you feel comfortable sharing with the group, sitting in the front. Yeah.
Was it that I feel more comfortable as a bystander than if I am the target? We talked about some of the ways that we've seen this is a lot with like through sexism at the bedside. So so I was saying that I feel more comfortable as a bystander being able to interfere and advocate for someone else and be like, hey, that was disrespectful. We don't treat each other like that. Versus if I'm the target, I feel more like I would probably go to humor and be like, well, I'm from here, so that was a quick trip, wasn't it? I would usually resort to humor because I would be it would shook me more than being able to be a bystander.
Cute. I think I see a comment in the back.
We had a great noon conference a month or two ago about microaggressions and how to handle them. And one of the things that came up during that session was that depending on the person who made the comment, like if this person has dementia or is a patient that maybe you won't actually be able to make any improvements or correction per se in their assumptions, you may do something simple in the room, like it's not okay to talk to people like that. And then outside the room, if you're the bystander, do something more supportive for the person who is the got the impact of that, just because we do take care of a lot of people that unfortunately you're not going to be able to correct their underlying assumptions, but that doesn't mean you can't be supportive of the target kind of outside the room.
That's such a great point. Yeah, because a bystander intervention isn't always directed at the person who dealt out that microaggression. Sometimes the bystander intervention is offering support to the target, validating their experience as being difficult. And then sometimes it's as someone for your team, right? Like step out of the room and say, hey, this happened. I felt impacted by this. How are you doing having observed this? And that can be a bystander intervention too. It's great. Yeah. And then for group 2, which category did you feel like this fell into? The microaggression, overt aggression, or discrimination?
I mean, it feels pretty overtly aggressive to me.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah, sometimes they're very subtle and unintentional. Sometimes they're pretty forthright in what they think, right? Okay. All right, we'll move on to the next one. For group 3.
We had said that this is kind of an example of overt discrimination. So this is a clearly aggressive kind of act. I think a little bit some component of, I can't remember the terminology, but one of the other ones, because I feel like this a little bit is something that could potentially be directed to someone who, like in this example, is an Asian American woman who, like this stereotype is of like being submissive and meek and kind of not like respecting this person's agency and their own ability to say no and to, you know, reject this person.
Yeah.
We also talked a lot about wanting to just be very direct, both as the person and the bystander, in saying, not just being like, oh, I'm not interested, or like avoiding the question, but just being like very direct that this is an inappropriate, like this is very inappropriate. I'm not okay with this. And like saying a word like stop, like do not do this again. And then having to escalate that if necessary. Also, yeah, I think ours did not have the who that this person was a resident or a neurosurgeon, but also yes, definitely that that's again another example of something that affects this person's one willingness to speak up and say no and be direct, but then also the person that they're like the attending in this example, their perception of this person as having that agency and respecting when they use their agency to say no and be direct.
Yeah, thank you. That's really great. And thank you for bringing up the power dynamic too, right? This person is a trainee who received this message from her attending, and your attendings, do evaluate you. And she may potentially need to operate with him again. I can only imagine how awkward that would be to be in a long surgery with someone that you had to set a boundary for in that way. And I'm curious, for anyone else in that group, what kind of bystander intervention did you guys think about?
In this situation, it feels as though there's not like a typical bystander in that there's somebody watching the interaction since it's happening over text message. But we had talked about the bystander may be somebody that she tells this to and is offering support as she's choosing to report the situation, which, as you mentioned, would be really challenging based on the power dynamic. And so there may be like going with the person to talk with program leadership or whatever and helping support actually reporting the situation, which would be challenging. I mean, the only like benefit of this situation, I guess, is that it happened over text message. And so it is easy to screenshot and report with that versus potentially this neurosurgeon doing like a he said, she said sort of thing. It's pretty clear that this is an inappropriate interaction.
Yeah, thank you. That's really great. So a little bit of context for this that I think is interesting. I had looked up a nationwide survey study from 2023 that said that Asian women reported having been sexually harassed in the past year at 38% had experienced that. And then what was really interesting about that study was that in contrast to Caucasian women who had been sexually harassed at a similar rate, actually, the major difference was the rate in reporting. So Asian American women reported at only 4.8%, whereas the reporting rate of sexual harassment by Caucasian women was about 16%, which is still abysmally low, right? That's abysmally low. But the stark contrast of almost 4 times as much reporting, I think, speaks to some of the difficulties you guys were alluding to with the power dynamic and maybe cultural inhibitions about speaking out. There's such a strong suck it up culture in medicine and among Asian Americans, right? And by the way, I had to look up that reflex too. I was like, what? And I could understand why there would be some pictures. So let's move on to case 4.
We had 4, and this was one we both agreed was just overt discrimination. And I saw a lot of kind of that feigned ignorance, sort of that learned, oh, I had no idea. And I'm a very big fan of calling that out and when you see it, but I'm just sort of a big fan of calling things out in general. My response was, oh, apparently you misunderstood what I was saying. I was not referring to our secretary and our administrator, who are both fabulous at their jobs and integral members of our team. I was referring to the research committee. Now, looking around, you can see I am the only woman on the research committee. So now that we're discussing it, this seems like a great time to talk about how that affects bias.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that this could be a microaggression on an interpersonal level, but also speaks to an organizational level discrimination because the person who this quote was pulled from was actually not on the research committee, felt like she was excluded from the research committee. And then when she was applying for promotion in her professorship, was told, you haven't done all the extra work like being on committees. Which that she was excluded from. And it kind of speaks to how there can be like a very small difference, but over the years, that trajectory can really widen, that gap can really widen, especially in academia.
One of the things we talked about too, though, was when addressing this, how you want to be so cognizant of and cautious of not talking down on saying, well, but they're just a secretary and an administrator, like being very, very aware of acknowledging everybody's part on the team and building them up and not allowing them to be seen as less than.
That's such an important point. Yes, I love that. Any kind of bystander responses?
individual response were very similar, and similarly felt like we wanted to support the person that they were just kind of gesturing to. And that person to me felt like they were being almost used as like a token woman. It was really kind of dismissive or downplaying them as well. So it was kind of targeting multiple people, the woman who wanted to be on the research committee, and then also these women in the room doing important jobs, but them just sort of gesturing like, see, there's a woman sitting here, so we're good. Yeah.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And then any other comments or responses from the group on any of the cases that you didn't work on? Okay. So the conclusions from our study are that all but one participant reported experiencing microaggressions or discrimination. About half of our participants said that the microaggressions occurred frequently, and by frequently, this varied from once a week to every day to every other patient encounter. And then about 30% of participants had experienced overt aggressions and discrimination. So these instances were less common, but they had major impacts on people's job satisfaction as well as their overall well-being. So I'll conclude with just a few quotes that I thought were really influential. In How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram X. Kendi said, "It's not enough to be not racist." I think this reminds us that to just kind of passively say, okay, I'm just going to not be racist in my daily life is not enough. If we want to build the kind of world for ourselves and our children that we would be proud to have our children inherit, then we need to take an active anti-racist stance. So then I'd like to have call you to a commitment to action. So I realize that in these times, things are scary, right? And actually, yesterday we had some ICE agents who were very close to our house. And when my spouse told our nanny that, who happens to be an immigrant with brown skin, she seemed to get kind of stressed out. And everything was happening so fast, I didn't really quite register. And she told us that she was not going out as much. And then as I was putting my baby to sleep, in that moment of kind of vulnerability of holding someone that you love and having that tenderness come out, it actually dawned on me the full scope of that. So she's been basically putting herself under house arrest because of this very real fear of deportation. And the only time that she leaves her house now is to come to work. As a legal resident of this country, this is what she and many other people feel compelled to do at this point. And then with the ICE killings of Renee and Alexis recently, it might feel overwhelming to think that we could even do anything at all. We could very easily feel paralyzed by fear. And so that's why I want to take a moment to have you write down your piece of paper. What is one small act? It doesn't have to be anything brazen or big, but what is one small act that you can commit to in the next month? Maybe this is something that's outwardly visible or could even be just purely internal work. And then this is totally voluntary, but does anybody want to share what they wrote? I think if you share with others, you're more likely to hold yourself accountable and do it. So we get one or two people to share.
I sent an email to, this is perfect timing, sent an email to a lot of the people in this room about, it's an open letter that I wrote that I am sort of looking for co-signers, sort of position statements about ICE presence. That's something that a commitment that I'm working on.
Thank you. I would love to sign that letter.
Thank you.
That's great. Yeah.
There is also a lot that one can do donating. There are like a lot of associations that we can help. Like they like help people that are targeted with to get lawyers to get all of these things. So I think that donating is also a way in which we can help.
Absolutely. Got one more in the back.
I'm leaving tomorrow to go to Uganda, and
Wow.
I'll be meeting with the medical students who will be coming here on the scholarship that we sponsor for the month of May. And I'm trying to figure out how to prepare them for the fact that they are coming on a visa. They'll be legal, but like my worst nightmare is that they get picked up and sent to another country. And so I haven't figured out what I'm doing yet and how to prepare them and how to keep them safe.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we'll end with a final quote. So this is a book that I really love by Isabel Wilkerson, who is the first Black woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for journalism. In this book, Caste, she gives this great analogy that I find really helpful for people like myself, as an immigrant or anyone whose family recently arrived in this country, to understand how we fit into the framework for racism and anti-racism work. So I think it's very easy as someone who's recently arrived to think, wow, like my ancestors weren't around for slavery or the genocide of indigenous people or the internment of Japanese Americans. Like we just got here in the 1980s. Like, I didn't get involved in any of that. But so the analogy she makes is we didn't build it, but this is the house we inherited and the one that we live in. So we bought this house, in 2026, but 20 years ago, there was a roof leak that never got fully addressed. And then 5 years ago, there was that pipe that burst in the basement. And we can say, whoa, I wasn't the owner, not my problem, right? But this is the house that we inhabit now. And so each of us has a responsibility to address these issues to make sure that this remains a healthy habitat for ourselves and our children and their children. And then just a deep thanks to all of our study participants. This is the first paper that's been published from this work. This is our research team with the medical students who at that time were medical students and are now residents. And this is on an open access journal in the American Journal of Surgery, so you can read the article. And then we have a second paper that will soon be published in the Journal for General Internal Medicine. Thank you all. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to let me know. Stick around.